Thank you.
All right, so I don't know how necessary this page is, so I'm just going to start with, could you tell just the basic story of your service?
Okay. Well, first of all, my name is Katherine with a K. Katherine Ann Simmons Fruedenburg, and I go by Kit.
Okay.
And how did it all start? Well, I went into the service in May of 1973 and into the Women's Army Corps, which was a part of the United States Army. The women have always been part of the Army since, well, I think officially since World War I. But the Women's Army Corps had its own line of command, and so we were billeted separately. We had separate basic training. We had separate. And then about a third of the way into my military service, we were blended into the Army, and so it was different. But what wasn't different is that we wore different uniforms. We wore uniforms that didn't match. We wore uniforms that I was one time stationed in Colorado, and my uniform was a lightweight jungle fatigue uniform. We wore. It was just different than what it is today. And the military blended us in, and then I got out December 20th of 1976, and so it was an interesting time to be in the military, because it was the time when the military changed from the draft to the all-volunteer. It was a time of racial tensions. It was a time of the women being blended in. So it was just very, very an interesting time to be in the service. The other thing is the branch of the service that I was in the intelligence field. And it was also very interesting because things just were changing, the way that intelligence was gathered, the way that intelligence was disseminated. It was just a fascinating time, and if I hadn't gotten married, I probably would have stayed in the service.
Oh, really?
It was quite the career. So I'm one of 7 children. I'm the eldest girl. I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, and my sister Shayla was in the Marine Corps, and my sister Jenny was in the Navy. My father was in the Army because everyone of his generation was in the Army that could serve, or in the military that could serve. But we weren't a military family. He was a university professor. And I just ended up going into the service because I had tried college. I had lived in Europe for a couple of years. I was just bouncing from one thing to another. And a friend said, you have to find something that you cannot be fired from. And I went to the military recruiting station, and I thought I would join the Air Force, and the Air Force guy didn't even want to talk to me. Yeah. He just said, here's some brochures, have a look, come back. And the Army guy, the Army man, soldier, he got me a cup of coffee, he sat me down, he said, here. And when you talk to people in the military, they always tell you the recruiter lied to you, and yes, he did. He said it would be like going to junior college, and it was not. It was just awful, basic training. So I went into the military because I was kind of floating through life. The other thing is that most of the people I was with were younger than I, and I was older by a couple of years. I was 21 when I went into the service, and most of the people were 18 and 19. But by going into the intelligence field, I was over into an area where most of the people were older. So it was basic training. Let's see. I lived in Michigan at the time, so I enlisted in Detroit, and first you had physical, and then you had an intelligence test, and then you had, they want to make sure you were fit, and for women that you weren't pregnant, and then or any drugs, and then you had an intelligence test, and then you were sworn in, and handed a packet of information and told to come back to the airport. And I flew to Atlanta, Georgia, and took a bus to Fort McClellan, Alabama, because our basic training was separate from the men's.
Yeah.
So I did my basic training there in June and July, and then went to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, to the intelligence school. And I really did not care for basic training. Some people do. Some people, it's a lot of fun, and you do a lot of fun things, and it's team building, and you learn leadership skills, and you do all kinds of fun things. But I did not enjoy it. I was in with a group of women. There were 40 of us. It was a big room, kind of like what's out there. Just imagine 40 bunks, and there you were. Most of the women were reservists, and so they were going to go home as soon as basic training was over. And so it was, met some very interesting people in the military. I mean, in basic training, and learned basic first aid. Did not learn how to fire a weapon at all. That was not part of our training. Learned your military code of conduct, had physicals, dental examinations, and whenever you got wrinkled, you had to press your uniform. That was the big thing for women. We always were pressing our basic training uniforms, which were baby blue, and the skirt stood out like a bell. And we wore black socks and black ugly shoes, and marched everywhere. And it was just, so it was so different from the training nowadays. When I see it on the television or I talk to other women about it, it's just different. Fort Huachuca, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. It was so much fun. I'd never been in Arizona before. Fort Huachuca is almost all the way down on the Mexican border. It was high desert. It was hot. It was August, September. We were in class. I was in the intelligence school, and so I was learning how to, my MOS was a 96 Bravo, which is an intelligence analyst, order of battle specialist. And what my job was to take information from multiple sources and try and figure out what was going on. So just imagine at a time of war, you have prisoners of war, and people are interrogating them and getting information and giving you the information. And then you have refugees who are milling around and telling their story. And then you have the people who are fighting on the line, and they're telling you what they see. And you have photograph imagery, and it's telling you what is behind the line and what you're seeing. And then there are several other sources, and you're pulling them all together, and you're briefing whoever is the leader, the general, the colonel, whomever, and saying, you know, you have on the other side of the line is a division, and then they have a company of tanks, and they've got artillery, and there's so many men, and they're going to do this, and they have the capability of doing this, this, and this. And so what my job was to pull all of that together and to say, this is what's here, this is what's there, etc. So and so what I was in school for is I was in school to learn how to pull those threads together, and I just really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. It was very challenging to be a woman in that field. So it just it was great. It was great. I enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I was then sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, which is right outside of DC, and I was assigned to a project called the Purge Project, where we destroyed military records. Not just military. What we destroyed out of date and no longer viable security documents.
Oh.
And it was very boring, and you had to review 800 a day.
Wow.
And so you wore little rubber thumbs, and you were always looking. And if the person had a criminal record, there was anything suspicious, etc., then you would set it to one side. But all the rest of them, you would just put in something, and then you had to sign your name. So every night I would sign my name on a whole bunch of pieces of paper, so that the next day I could put them in this file. Extremely boring. And that was the time that the military, so we were reading things like displaced people's reports. So these were people that came in the United States after World War II. It just was, there was just a lot of paper that just couldn't be held anymore. And of course, we were all changing over to the computer world, and so what are you going to do with all this old paper? And then I had the opportunity to be transferred, and a friend of mine who I had known at Fort Huachuca had recommended me to his officer, who then recruited me, who then asked for me, and I was transferred to Fort Carson, Colorado, which is out in Colorado Springs. It's where the there's a big ice training facility there at the Broadmoor, so the Olympic people are always there. The Winter Olympics are on right now. I love it.
Yeah.
But it was, again, I was out in the high desert. The Rocky Mountains are right there in your backyard. It was wonderful. But the difference is that from Fort Meade, I was in a headquarters outfit, and when I went to Fort Carson, I joined, I was part of an outfit that could ship out at any time. So we were always preparing, we were always practicing, we were always, what we call snooping and pooping. We were always looking at real life data. And so all of a sudden, after being out of it for about 6 months, I was back in real world intelligence. And it was absolutely fascinating. I loved it. I loved it. And we would several times gear up, so to speak, and get in a convoy and go down into the what we call downrange, going down into open spaces, and people would fight and shoot and move equipment around, and our job was to review the information that was coming in so that our side would win.
Huh.
And but a big part of what we did is keep track of what the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact people were up to, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But part of it was, and also this was the wind down, the fall of Southeast Asia, and so a lot of intelligence that we looked at was about Vietnam, well, Cambodia, Vietnam.
Yeah.
And it was very sad. It was very sad. And then when that was all finished, we turned our attention to the Middle East and the Palestine and Israel and that mess over there. So, and I got married when I was in the service. My husband had actually been in Vietnam, and Roger Lee Fruedenburg, and he's from Idaho. And we were going to stay in, but it was difficult. We could see that it was going to be difficult for us to be able to move as a couple. So we decided to get out and to go back to school. And I do remember there's a time in your life when you can't go back in the service. like for women at the time it was age 30. And I remember as my birthday was coming up going, should I go back in, should I go back in? Because I did miss it so much, miss it so much. So, but fortunately I've always worked in the line of work where you get information from a lot of different sources and you pull it together and you find the threads and then you make a report. So it's been a good life, but I always wonder, my sister Shayla did retire from the military, and my sister Jenny when she was in the Navy, did go into the reserves, but she did, and then she got out, but she works for the VA, and she's a Navy nurse.
Really?
But, so I've always wondered what it would have been like to have stayed in. They would not have allowed me to, we would not have been able to stay together as a couple. And so we just decided to get out, so. Any more questions on that?
Let's see. Oh, okay, that works. What year were you born?
I was born June 3rd, 1951 in Palo Alto, California. My father was at Stanford University. And let's see, we had, in 1955 we moved to Marquette University in Milwaukee, and he was a professor there. And then in 1960 we moved to Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. And that's where he retired as a dean, assistant dean, associate dean. But anyway, so, but university. So I had always, and he was a foreign language professor, so I've always been around foreign languages, people from different countries, different cultures. We celebrate, today is Chinese New Year, so Gang Hei Fat Choi, or yesterday. And, but it's actually 15 days long, so any day for the next 15 days would work. So I've always, we were raised to always be curious and to try different things. And like I said, I was just drifting. A lot of people ask, particularly at that time, why did you go in service? And for the women, we always said we got a guy in trouble and had to leave town. Because at that time, when a young man got in trouble, usually the judge would offer him the option of you going to jail or you going to the service, which would you prefer? And a lot of young, not a lot, but men that I know of that I graduated from high school or who didn't graduate from high school went in the service, like, because that was their option at that time. And there was a draft out there, so anybody could be drafted at that particular time. There were very few deferments, very few deferments.
This isn't a very personal question at all, but what years was Vietnam?
Well, Vietnam, for the people in Vietnam, it started during the colonial occupation by France and England, and then World War II, they were occupied by Japan. And after World War II, they, as well as many countries, assumed that they would be a free nation, and France did not want to give it up. And so the French part of the Vietnam War is the 1950s. The United States got involved starting in 1960, 61, 62. In 64, we were pretty much hooked in there. The sad thing about Vietnam is the fact that, and again, this is my personal opinion, was the fact that the military misled the civilian leadership. And it was very easy, I think, for military to mislead because they were the heroes of World War II, they were the heroes of Korea. General Westmoreland misled President Johnson. McNamara came to realize it and wrote his paper. And we were just misled for such a long, long period of time. If you have seen the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, it's probably, it is the closest. It is the closest to the truth that I've seen in a long time. You know, every day we would destroy a trail. By night they would rebuild it and be running the supplies down. They would attack, we would kill them, in a week they would be back. We would try and convert the minds and hearts, that was our original thought, and then it was, what the hell, we're just bombing them. And we bombed a lot of that country, indiscriminately. So, I should say indiscriminately, but if you thought there was something bad going on, usually you'd call bombs in. And when we would look at aerial photography and you would know that there was something going on, but you couldn't do anything, and then when you could do something, it would be too late. Or you would be looking at an area and you wouldn't see anything, and then it would come out later that there was a whole battalion hidden in there. And it just was awful. And the sad thing is that it got so that a lot of people, we just wanted to get out, get out and come home. So now, by the time I was in the service, the military, our military had pulled out, but we were watching province after province and town after town, and the funny thing is Walter Cronkite was a great newscaster, journalist, and excuse me. He would report the news, and I would look at the television. I go, that's not what's going on. And so for the longest time afterwards, I never really, to me, he's not the most trusted newscaster in the world, because he didn't know the truth. He didn't have the truth. And I think that journalism today is trying so hard to find the truth that they're beating it to death. But again, a personal opinion. But it's there's just an awful lot of those threads today of admiring so much the military that ignoring what's going on, and investing so much in our military, which is a good thing, but we have the largest military in the world. And it's not working out. It's not working out.
Do you think that the truth about Vietnam was that we were being misled by the military, or what do you think the truth is in that scenario? In politics, the United States always has wanted to support the strongest person. So we supported dictators in third world countries because they would keep the country peaceful, and we could trade. We could get out our oil, we could get out our natural resources, we could sell them things, they would sell us things. And what happened in Vietnam is that we backed a lot of bad people to be the leaders of that country, who were brutal dictators themselves. And the military, I have to think that a lot of the leaders there knew that it wasn't right. I would hope that they knew that it was not a winning situation, but the military is ordered to do things, and it does things. And when something is put into action, this is what you're going to do. That's what you have to do. But General Westmoreland, for sure, he was just dead wrong. He was just dead wrong, and he believed he was right, and he just kept on doing it. So
I wasn't sure if you attributed malintent or just being wrong.
I think at a period of time he knew that he was wrong, and the leadership knew that they were wrong, but just didn't know, but just kept at it, thinking that there was a chance, but there wasn't. There wasn't. It was not at all like Korea, where it was a continent that could be cut off
but even then, we're still dealing with what General MacArthur put into action up there. And finally Truman had to fire him. And finally Johnson and McNamara fired Westmoreland. So it's war makes you do a lot of really bizarre things, and it changes you. So
what do you think was America's goal for Vietnam? Where are you starting attention?
I think that America's leaders had been convinced. Well, first of all, I think that the United States leadership and the American people were absolutely petrified of communism.
Yes.
And so, I mean, when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, it never before had one nation under God, indivisible. It was never in there. But it got stuck in there in the 1950s because of the godless communists. And this is a way to ensure that Americans who are saying the pledge are not godless communists. So, and everything was set up to fight against communism. We got suckered into the Korean War because of our fear of communism and the Red China invaded. That's an old term there. The People's Republic of China invaded through Korea, and so we saw Southeast Asia as part of this falling domino theory.
Yeah.
We were able to, the military and the politics were able to contain things in Europe and in the East European sector, but it just was so. It seemed like it was going to be another short action, would be in, would be out, home by Christmas kind of a thing. And it was just the fear of a different belief system.
Yeah.
A different belief system. You know, there's been a communist party in France forever, and they don't do terrible things. I'm not advocating communism or socialism or anything like that. But, okay, maybe a little bit of socialism. But it's a bad thing. We have to do whatever we can to stop it. And that kind of mentality has gotten the United States into trouble before, and it certainly did in this instance.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Vietnam, we went in, and then did we pull out for a few months, and then we went back in? Is that true?
We invested in special forces operations and in a campaign for the hearts and minds of the people. And so it was a limited endeavor. It was well supplied, and there were well-trained, well-led men there. But it wasn't to be a fighting action, it was to be a support action. Yeah. And then it became, we're going to fight. And I think by 1967, 68, we were pretty much in the thick of it. My husband went over in, I think 1969, 70, 71, I think was when he was there. And that was when we were starting to pull out again. And that was an interesting time too. He said you had to get rid of everything that you had, and so again, getting rid of documents, getting rid of equipment. I mean, we left so much darn equipment there. And he said they buried stuff, they buried equipment.
Oh, really?
So that it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands or tried to destroy it. But and then the war was pretty much over. Well, it was over in 1975. I remember April 1975, just sitting there in a top secret facility, looking at what was going on and reading the materials, the machine that was printing it out, that was coming in with all of the information, and watching the end of it. And it was kind of very sad to watch the people around me who had been there, who had friends die there.
Yeah.
But it was also, okay, we're done. What's next? And move on. You're asking me the tough question.
I'm trying to think.
I knew
of
I
a
should have
phrase.
read up before I came and talked with you. Excuse me.
Um, So what are some specific engagements that you were involved in as far as the war? Anything really notable that happened in your career maybe?
So much that I did was secret, that there's so much I don't know what's still secret.
Oh, really?
So there's a lot that I can't talk about. I will tell you that when I got out of the service, I had to sign a statement that I would not travel through a communist country, and I could not fly over a communist country. So for the longest time, for the years that I lived in Germany before the service, I have very good friends there, and one of them lived in Berlin, and I really wanted to go to Berlin and visit her, and I couldn't. And now the opportunity is there. I haven't been. I really should go and see what it's like. But I think the fall of Vietnam and watching it unfold. But again, I'm watching it through materials that are coming across the desk and photographs, and I'm watching it through somebody else's eyes, through somebody else's thoughts, and pulling it together and letting the general know. And it's not like he's going to do anything, because we're just watching it. We're watching it end. I think the most interesting thing was the first time that I started looking at things in the Middle East, and it's such different people, different culture, different history, and having to rethink things from. I was trained primarily on anti-Soviet Union, anti-Eastern European bloc, and then taught all about Southeast Asia, and then at the end of my career, what's happening in the Middle East. And so it was just very interesting going from three different kinds of cultures.
That is fascinating. So just to recap, what years were you in service, just so we can have...
I was in the service from May of 1973 to December 1976, and I was supposed to get out in May of 1976, but my husband and I had decided to get out, and so I extended my term of service until when he was getting out. The other thing is that we didn't want to get out until right before Christmas. And the military, everybody wants to go on leave for Christmas, so they want to take care of all the paperwork beforehand. So they wanted us to get out. And we kept saying, we want to stay in until right before Christmas. We have nowhere to go. We have nowhere to go because we're going back to college. Both of us had 2 years of college at that time. And I said, we have nowhere to go. We want to go into college, and so we can't move into merit student housing until Christmas. So please, we don't want to get out of the service. And they kept all the time. The other thing is that they paid us off in cash.
Really?
They paid us off in cash. The military was so odd. First of all, you can never be seen in your fatigues off base. They don't want. This was a time when the American people did not particularly care for the military.
I guess so.
We had bad thoughts.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to go to the drive-in bank, you would take off your jacket or your shirt. You'd be wearing a white T-shirt, and so there you are, hips down, you're in your fatigues and your combat boots, etc., and doing your business there. You were allowed to buy gasoline. That was the only time you were allowed to get out of your car. but in your fatigues, you went to work, home and to work. I had lived in barracks, and then when we got married, we had a place. And before I got married, I lived off post, and then but it was just very, very odd. Where was I going with this story? You asked me, but I paid me off of cash. So we had to turn everything in. So first of all, you get everything issued, but then they take everything back, okay? But it has to be in good condition. It has to be in good condition. Well, heck, you've been playing war in this thing for 2 years. Roger had been to war in his fatigues. So, granted, those were his jungle fatigues, but you had to turn all the stuff back. I could not keep my fatigue jacket because it wasn't truly a fatigue jacket. I was wearing something that was left over from the Korean War, and actually it was a wool, the kind of thing you saw General Eisenhower wear with the little belt there. They did not have fatigues for women, okay? They did not have, I could buy fatigues or I could wear what was issued, and so I chose to wear what was issued. My pants buttoned up on each side.
Oh,
It was
really?
just the oddest stuff. It was just the oddest stuff. Women's fatigue boots, the bottoms were slick as could be. The men had these nice little soles that you could walk and not fall on your face. I'm not the women's boots. Oh my God, it was terrible. But it was funny. It was funny. Okay, it was just very funny, and you just had to laugh. So they paid me off. We had saved up our leave time, and we were cashing it in. I thought, because here you are, you're leaving post, you're doing your last thing, you're signing your last paper, and they paid me off in $20 bills. And they paid, and my husband too. We had more money that would fit in my purse. Here's another funny thing. When I entered the service, women got issued purses. Men got issued underwear. So women were not issued underwear. We got a purse instead. So the purse was full of the money. Our pockets, our inside pockets. We went straight off post to our bank and turned in all of this money. I was positive we were going to get robbed. Can I show you some photos?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So this is when I was in E5. This was about 1976. September 1976. The other thing is we didn't have cell phones with cameras on it, and we didn't have cameras, and I worked in an intelligence field, so we were discouraged from taking photos. So I'm amazed at how little we had. And you could see, we just really looked very different. There you are. In 1975, I went on, the United States has to prove that it can lift an entire brigade to Europe in case the Russians invade, okay? So that's what we were doing, and this airplane was flown by an Air National Guard person, with the Air Force. The seats all sat backwards, and I did earn an Army Commendation Medal because I was really very good at what I did. But there's a picture of me getting it. I was an E1, E2, forever. Just remember, there's a whole different way of us being promoted. And so this is in Fort Meade, Maryland. And so this had to have been in 1974. And also I had long hair. Now, because the military made it an object to make it difficult if you had short hair, I of course grew my short hair long and had to have long hair. And this man also, I can't remember his name, but he also was transferred to Colorado at the same time I was. Let's see. Nope. So this is my husband and I just shortly before we got married in Colorado, and you can see that you're not supposed to walk and hold hands. That was another thing. But you can see that our fatigues are different. On my fatigues, I've got my shirt out, and it's because I've got those funny little buttons that go on up the side, and it's just funny. Let's see. But as you can see, I'm having a heck of a good time.
You look like it.
I just really had so much fun. One of the things that happened is that while I was at Fort Carson, we went to shoot. And the person that you loaded your own ammunition, they issued you an M16, and we went downrange to the shooting range, and you got in this little firing pit that was full of water usually, and the getting ready to shoot, and the Sergeant Joe Haffey, and he said, "Okay, Kit, go ahead. You're cleared to fire." And I said, "Okay, how do you turn this thing on?" And he said, "What do you mean, how do you turn this thing on?" I said, "I've never shot any of these before. How do you turn this on?" He said, "Here, give this to me and get out." And then they taught me how to do it. So you know how to fire an M16, but it was it was just. I didn't have that as part of my basic training. I never threw a grenade. I never shot an M16. So it was just odd. The other thing is when you went downrange to play war, you had to take an M16 with you. And if you got it dirty, you had to clean it. Well, I didn't know how to clean it, so I would take my M16 and I would wrap it in plastic.
Oh.
And I would wrap it in plastic. The other thing is that they were very hot on the black market, and so
really?
there was theft. And so you slept with that sucker. And so when you went to bed in your when you were downrange pretending to fight a war, you always had it with you. Mine, of course, was wrapped in plastic, and I always had it in a secure place. But I would lie it underneath my bag and lie on top of it, and so I always made sure that I had it. But one time, they did say, "Okay, we've gone down range, we've shot our M16s, we're going to take it apart." And so took it all apart, but I put it together. I had parts left over, and I said, "So here, where do we put these?" And but it was fun. The armor thought I was a riot. This is, I have this for some odd reason. This is someone that is posing as an enemy person.
Oh, so it's like
Yes,
propaganda.
and we had captured him.
Oh, really?
During a war problem. And he was going to be interrogated, and we were going to use the information, etc. But again, even though we didn't say this is East German or this is a Soviet, you can tell that the way that this person is dressed, he's dressed pretty much like at that time. I think the Eastern Germans were dressed, and when we would go and do these war problems. You know, you'd load up your equipment, you'd go down range, you'd have to set up and make secure, because even though you were doing a war problem and you were being, you would get the information in that the other team it was a problem. It's like, think of it as a crime that you had to solve. You know, what are they up to? What are they going to do? And they were always trying to make a wrong step. And to fool you into sending everybody this way when actually everything was going to happen there. Mm-hmm. And it was absolutely fascinating. And I was setting up the temporary, but the other thing is that we also had a real world that we were taking care of. So at the same time that we were playing war, we actually had, over on this side, real war intelligence happening. Mm-hmm. So I was there and I was setting up a board and putting up the map, and then you put a big piece of plastic, that's where I got my plastic, over the top of it, and with your grease pencils you were marking where everybody was and everything. And this young man came in and introduced himself, and I introduced myself with just first name kind of thing, and I was working on it, and we were flirting, quite honestly, we were just flirting. And he said, so what are you doing? Are you, one of the clerical? One of the things that always got me is how often I would be mistaken for clerical. And there's nothing wrong with being clerical. But I wasn't. I was an analyst. But because I was a woman, I was always, make the coffee. And I'd go, I'll make your coffee, I'll spit in it, so you need to go make your own coffee. Unless you want me to spit in your coffee. Somebody new would come into the office and they would assume that I would do the typing. And I would say, well, why don't you take a typing test? If the guy sat down in front of the typewriting, he passed the test. He could do his own typing. I didn't have to do his typing. I was very, very determined that I was going to make it. So this person says to me, are you going to be doing the reports and this, that, and the other thing? I said, no, I'm an analyst. I'm a 96 Bravo. And he said, I've never met a woman yet who knew what she was doing in this situation. And I knew that he shouldn't have been there, so I called an MP over, and it turned out that he was on the other team, that he had just snuck in to get warm. He wasn't over with the real world, intelligence world, but because we always had hot coffee and soup and sandwiches. And it turned out to be my husband-to-be. And that was it. And that's how we met. So it was just one of those things.
That is so funny.
Yeah, and later on, I could tell when he was writing the problems, because he always killed people the same way, so to speak, and I would go, oh, Roger's writing this problem, so kind of a thing. So that's pretty much it.
Oh, so how long after you met him did you get married?
It was a whirlwind. I met him in 74, in fall of 74, and we were married on the 4th of July, 1975.
Oh, wow.
So we've been married for 40-some years. And, there were other, just what you remember about the military are the funny things that happen every day. You just remember certain people doing certain things, friends that you have, and the good times that you have, and that's what does it. And you also remember the bad times, but it's remembering your friends that get you through it. Mm-hmm. So I did want to show you. So this is a year after we got out of the service. That's me, that's Barb Jones, and that's Kathy Haney. Mm-hmm. And we three were all in the service together at Fort Carson. Oh, wow. And she lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she lives in Portsmouth, Virginia. But all three of us, I went to the University of Minnesota. When we got out of service, we went to the University of Idaho, and I graduated there and then did my graduate work at Minnesota. And those two lived in Minnesota. So the three of us were in Minneapolis and St. Paul together. And it was just nice having that and laughing about some of the absolutely wretched things that we went through, particularly as women.
Oh, that's funny.
Do you ever meet with your military friends?
About 3 years ago, we went back to Virginia. We've lost touch with pretty much everybody, but and saw Barb and her husband back there. They live in a wonderful historic 1700s. Their house was built by the first silversmith in Virginia, I think.
That is so cool.
And she was a photographer, and Kathy was a radio operator, and at the end of the day, you had to do PT, physical training. And for women, it was awful because you were running in boots that were cardboard. Yeah. And they didn't let us change into PT shorts and things. You had to run in your uniform. And then every so often, you had to take a PT test, which I always passed by the skin of my teeth because I'm not a runner, never have been. And so here we are, 4 o'clock. And you go out and you do PT and you run, that's all you do is you run at that time. And it was about lunchtime, and the snow was coming down sideways, and Kathy said, "Kit, please tell me that PT has been canceled." And I said, "Kathy, PT has been canceled." "Okay, fine." And I left, and she called all the offices and told them that PT had been canceled. And afterwards, she said, "Why did you tell me that?" I said, "Kathy, did you not just tell me PT has been canceled? I thought you knew it was a joke." She got into a lot of trouble on it, and she never piped on me. She never said, "Oh, well, Kit told me that it had been canceled." She was so gullible. She was such a nice person. I really liked her. I really liked Barb too. Really liked Barb. And Kathy, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure she's probably still up in Minnesota. What were some of the other things? Oh, I will say that one thing that really infuriated me was the way that the enlisted were tested for drugs all the time, but not the officers.
Oh.
And not that our officers were big dopers. They weren't. They were alcoholics.
Oh.
I think almost everybody drank too much. Almost everybody drank too much in the service. I know of very few people that did not imbibe. And it just really infuriated me when we would be called out to have drug testing, and officers wouldn't, or we would be called out for this or that or the other thing, and you knew that if they took a blood sample from Captain so-and-so, that guy shouldn't be driving a car at that time. So I sometimes say to my husband, we really shouldn't be alive because of some of the things that you do. When you're young, you just think you're invincible. And not necessarily with drugs and alcohol, but just some of the physical things that you would do. We'd go, Colorado was just an incredible place for us to play. And we'd go tubing all the time, and rock climbing and rafting, and it was just, as you could tell, it was a good life.
Yeah.
It was a good life. And I wish I could tell you more about what I actually did, but again, I'm not sure. Every once in a while, something pops up on television, and you go, "Oh yeah, I remember that." For example, what's happening with some of the people who have been accused of colluding, some of the activities that they have done. I could for sure tell you that person would never get a background clearance, because those activities, if there's a police record, then it's in your record, and that's the kind of thing that the other side would use to blackmail you to tell them things. I mean, we were always aware of that. The other thing that would happen is every so often you'd be followed. And it was our people following you to make sure that what you were up to and who you were saying. The very first time I got my background investigation, I filled out this big long piece of paper, had to write down everywhere that I was, and they went back to my hometown of Rochester, Michigan, and started interviewing my friends. And at that time I was had just dropped out of college again, and so they were interviewing my college friends. And I was home on leave, and I said, "So did you get interviewed?" Because I got my background clearance and I got my security clearance. And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "We didn't know what was going on." I said, well, what did you think? And they said, "Well, we thought you had deserted, and we had made arrangements that we were going to smuggle you up into Canada." And I went, "Oh, good friends, good friends."
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a tippy top security clearance that was pretty tippy-top. So, and that's what we call it, tippy-top. I mean, I know there's a whole bunch of acronyms, but, and you just did silly things. Well, it just, another day, another dollar. When you start at 7 o'clock in the morning and you go until 6 o'clock in the evening and you work really hard and doing stuff, it just really helps to have a good time and to enjoy yourself. So, and to be with good friends. And there we are. Do you have anything else? Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I mean, what qualities do you believe, or you carried from the military to today?
I'm fiscally conservative.
Okay.
That's one of the things that being in the military, you never had any money.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just learn to do without. And, people talk about people from the Depression, holding out a string, rinsing out plastic bags, those sorts of things. You just, particularly as enlisted, the officers, I don't know, the officers got paid way more money, but then they had to provide way more. They had to buy their uniforms. But you could tell I was cheap because I was wearing the uniforms that didn't match because they were free rather than buying a uniform. A sense of teamwork. I think that's another thing that just really stays with you is a sense of teamwork and being a team. I am very sarcastic, and that really helped me a lot. My NCO, my non-commissioned officer, my sergeant that was in charge of me, used to refer to me as Simmons person, because to this day I hate when someone says the gals, you gals, because it took me a long time to break everybody in my office of saying honey, could you make the coffee, that sort of thing. So it just so for the longest time just Simmons person. And you just have to be sarcastic. I mean, the other thing is that when you get into a situation and you're trying to get people to do what you want to do, but you can't because you have absolutely no rank, it teaches you that you have to do something. But for a while you'd go like this. You'd feel, because that's where your rank was, you go, oh, it's not there anymore. So you have to figure out a way to get the team to do things because you no longer had the authority to tell people to do what they should be doing. We have 2 children. They have absolutely no interest in being in the military.
Really?
But again, it's not a military family, and it wasn't something I pushed them to. Yet my 4 brothers, who did not go into the military service, my brother that's just a year older than I, both of his sons were in the Air Force, and pilots, and one still is. And we have, on my husband's side, 2 nephews that are in, one is, I think Air Force also. But again, it's just, it wasn't, everybody, it was a tradition for my dad's family, but it wasn't a tradition for us. And then it was fun. It was fun. I often wondered what it would be like. Well, first of all, I'd be retired now, and I'd have a wonderful, wonderful pension. I do want to say one thing.
Sure.
After Vietnam, no one came up to you and said thank you for your service.
Yeah.
There were no parades. There was no nothing. Nowadays, you get recognized everywhere. If you're at a sporting event, people want you to stand. If you're at a banquet, people want you to stand. And I think what people go through now and the war now is horrific. So I don't want to take anything away from them, and I don't want to take anything away from, but it's embarrassing. And I don't know if people are recognizing the service because very few people go into the military. A very small percentage of people
Yeah.
actually go and fight. Military, I mean, there's very, and is that it? So you're relieved that you're not doing it, so you're saying thank you so much because you're gonna go do this horrific thing and I